All right. Let's see. We got the numbers ticking up here. We're up to 26 folks joined in. I think we got 27. Might as well get going, right?
Yeah, we can kick it off.
All right. I'll let you introduce yourself first.
Yeah, cool. Everybody, thanks for joining. My name is Chris Henderson. I am the Senior Director of Threat Operations here at Huntress. What that means in reality is that I manage all of the humans that write the detection logic and observe all the threats within our environments and your environments, and translate all of that into actionable defenses that catch and keep the bad guys out of your world. How about yourself, Brian?
Awesome. Hi, I'm Brian Milbier. I'm the VP of the Internal Information Security team here at CyberQP. I also work closely with our product team and our marketing team around anything security related to make sure that everything is secure and sound. Cool. All right.
It was slides. Killer.
Yeah, so for today's presentation or for today's webinar, Chris and I are going to talk a bit about his threat brief that Huntress has released, as well as the internal or a bunch of the threat briefs that or Chris's annual threat report, I should say, as well as the threat briefs that CyberQP has been releasing. A lot of the reason behind why we're presenting all this and talking to this for you guys is to help educate you on how to protect your business and protect your customers and really help have a threat-informed defense as you're building your security programs out. So, Chris, what are your thoughts on threat-informed defenses?
Yeah, in a I think when you look at the overall market, trying to determine what tools are going to be most effective against protecting my business, or what security controls do I put in place, I think a lot of SMBs, even mid-market and enterprise, they largely look at compliance frameworks in order to help direct their activities and understand the controls that they should be putting in place. Things like CIS, NIST, et cetera. And while all of those frameworks, they are great, they largely treat all of the control activities as equal. But when you as an SMB or MSP trying to protect your SMB clients or trying to understand, you're not going to be able to spend equally across all of those controls and technologies. Where do you disproportionately spend in order to get the most protection and value for your customers? Reading these threat reports, Verizon breach report, Microsoft defense report, the Huntress threat report, they really help inform you. These are the threats that are truly making it through to the SMBs, and what you actively need to protect against versus what you might need to more passively protect against. And so as you're going through and trying to make the determination of should I spend more on A or B, taking a threat informed look at that is really an important way to make sure that you're spending your money wisely. And you're not spending it where you're just most afraid. You're spending it where the businesses that protect your clients have actually seen threat actors be successful in deploying ransomware, data exfiltration, takeover, et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think the MSPs they have an interesting challenge that most other businesses don't as well, right? Because I think being cybersecurity and IT for all of their customers, they not only have to look at themselves and reflect on like who's going to attack my business as as an IT vendor and as a technology shop, but also who's attacking my customers, and then um, having to build defenses for those different customers that they have, depending on what industry they're in, right? Like what defenses you're going to build for a school, if you're supporting like a college, right? Like is much different than what defenses you're going to build if you're defending against, nation state adversaries, if you're supporting some defense contractor. So that's the other angle that's important as you're looking through the different reports, is looking at those industry verticals and understanding what attackers are going to be attacking your customers and what defenses they'll need in addition to what you need as a business.
No, absolutely. When I first got into information security, my boss asked me to go threat model something against our organization, and I was super intimidated. It was this big, scary thing. So I don't know how to do that. Uh, I want everybody here, as you're listening through this, we'll weave in some questions that you should ask yourself. But really, threat modeling isn't this big, scary thing. A threat-informed defense is not this big intimidating thing. Really, anybody can do it. It's what we want people, as we write these reports, the purpose of these are so that you can ask yourself a lot of very pertinent questions about your own defenses, but informed questions, right? If Huntress is seeing X, Y, and Z, well, it's likely that that same threat will face my organizations. What are the defenses I have against the threats that they are seeing in their reports? Similar with CyberQP from an identities perspective, as attackers move to the cloud and move to identities first, as other technologies have gotten stronger, it's really important to understand these are how attackers are getting into environments, and then what protections do I have against that? And so it's very much just looking at the reality of the world from the threats that are successful against organizations, and then asking your team, yourself, your clients, how are you defending against these, and are you prepared?
Yeah, I agree completely. A lot of times people see threat modeling and they see threat informed defense and they start diving into super technical things, right? Like, am I going to do a pasta threat modeling framework, or what framework am I using? And honestly, the best way to get started at it is just treating it like a little tabletop wargaming exercise, whereas you're reading reports like Huntress is, or reading the briefs that we're releasing based on these breaches that are happening, is just like sit down and have internal discussions with your team and say, hey, if this happened to us, what do we have for controls in these areas? Like, would we be ready? Do we have playbooks in place? Like, do we have processes to handle these type of threats and attacks? And really, that is the best place to start, is just having those discussions internally. And it can be just those easy tabletop discussions. And I think the biggest thing is just making sure that when you have those discussions, that you take those lessons learned and you create tickets or projects or tasks out of them. Because some people do have those discussions and they're like, all right, I had the conversation and now it's written down on a paper in the filing cabinet over there. I don't need to look at it again, right?
Yeah,
So,
and sometimes your action item is just I don't know, right? And the action item is to go figure out more information, but that's still like very valuable in
yeah,
order to it's still valuable to your company to document there are unknowns that you need to go and figure out, and so
yeah, absolutely.
yeah, it's all worth it.
Yeah, and there's so much open source intelligence out there, right? Like we talked about, or you talked about the Verizon report. There's, the IBM, the cost of a data breach report. You've got Microsoft. There's all these different articles. Pretty much every Intel and security vendor is releasing content like we're talking about here today between Huntress and CyberQP's content. But I think one of the interesting things when I was reading through the Huntress report was that I've read all the other reports, the Verizon reports. I try to keep up with all the different things so I can better protect CyberQP and understand the threats that are out there. But Huntress has the best view, I think, as far as the reports go, on what's actually impacting SMBs and MSPs, because they're focused on that, right? Like I know the Verizon report and the IBM report are starting to like edge into that, but because they don't really understand that MSP and SMB landscape as much as a vendor like Huntress does. A lot of their insights are either like too high level or too broad, and it's not really as actionable as a report from a vendor in the channel like Huntress. So I think with that, we should jump right into the report, Chris, and start, talking through what you guys saw
Yeah,
and what's happening out there with your customers.
perfect. Let's do it. So like Brian said, the Huntress threat report it's geared specifically towards SMBs and the MSPs that manage those organizations. We've derived this from firsthand observations across our customers. And the data used to populate this, it comes from both our managed EDR product as well as our Microsoft M365 MDR. Right, and all of this we've written so you can have your own threat-informed defense and really model how well am I protected against these, and so you can both protect yourself as an MSP and deliver qualified security to your customers. And so while we've looked at both M365 and endpoints, predominantly the data that we have in here is around endpoints, so we'll start there. At the end, I'll touch briefly on some of the threats facing M365, which will lead nicely into Brian and his threat reports. So let's talk endpoints, right? So what did we find? Three major things coming out of the endpoint world. First, there's a large decrease on the reliance of custom tools or traditional malware when it comes to initial access and perpetrating the attacks. We see a significant increase in the reliance of the malicious use of legitimate software, primarily RMM tools. And we see that cyber criminals are using older and more defunct strains of ransomware. And the whys of that we'll talk about in a little moment. But first, let's talk why are we seeing a decrease on the reliance of custom tooling and malware? Right, less than half of all the attacks that we reported in Q3 of 2023 leveraged malware as part of that attack chain. Uh, while Huntress primarily our visibility is post initial access, when you see the decrease of malware as part of the attack chain, right, natural conclusions there, social engineering is becoming more successful, credential stuffing of legitimate tools is becoming a more prominent initial access vector across the SMB. And so understanding where you have uh, access points through replaying of legitimate credentials. What are all of the entry points into your business in which the loss of your credentials could allow somebody to abuse that and gain entry into your environments?
Yeah,
Um,
I think one thing we see here is like it's that age old thing, right? Where like us on the good guys have to be right every time, where the bad guys only have to be right once, right? So you see that as AV started having showing some weaknesses, like all these EDR plays came up, and now everyone basically has EDR. So now the bad guys are pivoting again to say, like, hey, I used to be able to deploy all this malware and circumvent AV. These EDR tools that are out there are making that hard for me. Now they're living off the land and using a lot of these built-in tools and technologies, using your own tech stack against you, using your own identities against you, which is obviously why it's important to have monitoring in place too, because your EDR tool by itself really isn't going to be enough. Usually you need people actually looking at the output of that tool to see these behaviors and be able to draw that comparison. Is this a tech doing this activity, or is it actually a threat actor doing this activity?
no, absolutely right. And even with the sort of propagation and popularity of AI tools and large language models and generative AI, humans are still far better at determining what's off than these models are. And so, while you see many companies coming out with these right AI informed defenses, AI informed SOC, right? Our SOC is just an AI somewhere. All of those are just evolutions of EDR. That is not an MDR play. And so really you want that managed aspect. If you can't watch your own EDR, either because you don't have the technical expertise on staff or you don't have the funding for it, for whatever reason, outsourcing that to a third-party MDR really helps balance and look for those legitimate use of or illegitimate use of legitimate software. Right. And so as you're going through and reading this, doing your threat informed defense, right, you should be asking yourself, what technology do I have in my stack that detects this abnormal behavior of legitimate tools? And would I detect the illegitimate use of my own tech stack? Right. But then RMM tools, we see more and more and more of these. It's tough because these are super necessary, right? RMM tools are really what enable that one to many management of assets that enables the MSP model that we all enjoy. And while RMM tools allow for this ease of management for the MSP, they unfortunately offer those same benefits to the threat actors. And so all of the gains that we gain from utilizing RMMs in order to distribute our techs across state lines as well, those same benefits are super attractive to the threat actors attacking the SMB market. Right, we saw 65% of intrusions utilizing RMM tools in Q3 of last year, and this is tough, right? RMM software is signed; it bypasses Windows Safe Screen, and so when you install it, you're right. This is a very legitimate tool. It bypasses like any signature-based AV. Any EDR is largely going to whitelist these. And the RMM software is super commonly found in the SMB environments. So the presence of a new agent is very unlikely to trigger any new alarm, right? And worst of all, many of these RMM vendors don't verify the legitimacy of organizations that are starting trials. And so abuse of these RMM tools, not only is it easy to get them onto systems and use as part of your attack chain for either persistence or C2, but really there's not enough work done they don't even need to pay for this, right? Like they're signing up for trials and they're pivoting and using this and abusing it against you. And then in the identity space, let's say they do credential stuff your RMM, it may even be more advantageous for them to use that and pivot to attack other businesses rather than compromise your accounts by piggybacking and sort of living off the land of your tools to attack other businesses. Your tools, your IPs are sanitized and safe. And so the compromise of your RMM is going to also put other businesses at risk. We even saw this with a healthcare organization providing services to pharmaceutical companies.
Yep. Yeah, I mean I think the identity call out is huge, obviously, both because that's what we specialize in here at CyberQP, but also because it's really underserved, right? Like we don't in the MSP space, I think in the enterprise space they're starting to get there. But the MSP space, there's not a lot of thought that goes into protecting those identities and not having these standing privileges all over the place. In my years of doing incident response, I can't think of any scenarios where like a single piece of malware caused a significant impact, right? It's typically that malware gets the foothold or that initial access, and then from there they're pivoting to these privileged accounts or leveraging different tooling that you've got internally to try to spread across your machines at a customer across multiple customers.
No, absolutely, right. Defense against this is super hard as well, right? When you think about it, um, you can't block all RMMs because you use an RMM. So you could try to block all the ones that you don't use, and you can audit for the presence of multiple RMMs. Or right, you layer a defense with a EDR MDR strategy that just assumes that you will have this happen at some point and looks to catch it. But really, right, asking yourself, how do I know if a new RMM agent has been introduced to my environment is a really good thing as you're doing your threat informed defense. If you would be blind to the introduction of a new RMM agent to your client, that's a huge problem that you need to go and solve. Right, when we look at Screen Connect, very recent, Huntress went through, we identified all of our clients that were running the vulnerable version of the Screen Connect server, and we patched them. We jammed that patch into the environment using our agent, but yet we still saw people getting compromised through the use of the Screen Connect exploit. And we were scratching our heads trying to figure out, why is this? Because we've already patched these people. Why is it that they're still being exploited? At first, we thought ConnectWise had missed something and that the patch wasn't as complete as it needed to be. When we really dug into it, what we found was that some of our MSPs that had taken over from other MSPs hadn't fully cleaned out the old Screen Connect installs. And so what we ended up seeing was certain clients get popped through this vulnerability, not because the MSP that was currently protecting them was derelict in their duties, but because the offboarding of the previous MSP was not completed, or at least not to the total degree that it needed to be. Many number of reasons for this, right? I run Screen Connect, so if I run a query for Screen Connect, well, is this my instance or theirs? Right? This isn't a super easy problem to solve, but understanding where you have these entry points into your networks is really an important aspect in protecting yourselves against these threats, especially when your AV and your EDR by itself are not going to alert for every one of these.
Yeah, I agree. I've talked to lots of partners where as you start having this conversation, they don't have that visibility, and leveraging detection tools is critical, right? Like knowing what versions of RMM tools are out there and trying to limit that just to the one that you know you should have and that you're running to support your business is so critical from a security perspective. But I talked to some MSPs too who are happy because it also gives them insight if customers are looking at moving away from them, right? Like a lot of times they'll run two MSPs in parallel and the new MSP comes in and starts installing their RMM, then they're getting these detection alerts and it gives them a little bit of a heads up. So I thought that was kind of a funny twist on it, that it wasn't just security, but it was giving them that insight into like, hey, there's a new player in town at at this customer site.
Yeah, I think the business value of security controls is often grossly underlooked or overlooked, right? Like
Yeah.
there is, I try really with every security control that I put in place to pivot that into something that benefits the business as well as our own security posture, right? I try to at least derive as much revenue value for our company through the use of security tooling and security controls as I'm spending to deploy those tools. Not always possible, but some things, right? If you can position yourself as the more secure MSP in a geo area, the more likely it is you're going to gain that business from your competitors. Simply not by selling, FUD. You don't want to scare your customers and prospects, but by really helping them understand through a threat-informed sales strategy, right? These are the things facing you, and do you have protections against these? And does your MSP have protections against these? And being able to position yourself as the more secure option, especially given these real threats that we've observed in those environments, will help win some of those deals as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think along the same lines of RMMs and like having those leftover RMMs out there, like that's a really interesting story because I hear a lot on the identity side where they have similar problems with these privileged credentials where they don't know what accounts live out there on local machines in an Active Directory. Because when you're managing hundreds of customers, it's hard to manage all of those identities. So like I hear the same thing on the identity side where maybe there's a break glass account left over from an old MSP or there's technician accounts that are floating around out there. So outside of the RMM, I think it's also important to know what privileged accounts live on all these devices you're supporting because those privileged accounts is another way that these actors use to pivot into to impact your business and to get that foothold and pivot across machines.
Yeah, I mean, strong inventories have always been and will always be one of the strongest security controls that you can implement. And a lot of this isn't worth doing if you don't have a really strong inventory in which to base it off of. An inventory not only of the right, what assets do I run, what software running on those assets, but also the identities that I protect and what is authorized to access what.
Yeah, yeah. I mean that when I started here, seeing QGuard that we have where we can do that discovery was one of the reasons why I was like, this is going to be really beneficial to MSPs being able to get that inventory and maintain it. Because, right, like doing it once sometimes is easy when it comes to these inventories, but maintaining it, automation is critical. And having some tool that's constantly like, hey, there's a new domain admin that was created, or there's this new service account that lives out there is critical. Because, first of all, bad guys create new accounts to keep their persistence on that network. And
Absolutely.
from an operational risk perspective too, it's important, right? Like you don't want to, a technician creating another account because they're trying to circumvent a process or a control that you've put in place. So just knowing what's out there is really critical. So you can't protect what you don't know exists, right?
No, absolutely. I think one of the more interesting things I found from our threat report. So while we saw 25% of ransomware incidents deploy Lockbit, and Lockbit is certainly evil, right? Like Lockbit is an enterprise level ransomware operator, and so when you think through, yes, they are evil, but there is a benefit of being attacked by a mature organization. As weird as that sounds, knowing that the infrastructure that holds the decryption keys in the worst case scenario, if you decide that you have to pay, there's a high likelihood that you actually can decrypt. There is sort of a honor amongst thieves of their own groups where you're unlikely to get hit immediately by the same actor after remediating. And if you did pay, what we saw was 60% of the ransomware incidents were using defunct strains that are no longer under active development by their authors, but are not yet in the No More Ransomware database of decryption keys. And really, I think what we're seeing here is while I think a lot of people are familiar with this notion of the SMB cybersecurity poverty line, which is the revenue line in which if you make less than, you really are priced out of a lot of the enterprise security tools. Similar things happening in the cyber criminal world where these low-level cyber criminals are priced out of buying into Lockbit. And so what you're faced with is a rather immature organization trying to take advantage of what they hope is your immature security protocols. And so, right, we need to layer our defenses against these and really understand, and asking yourself, should an attacker make it far enough to deploy ransomware? Like, how do I minimize the impact of that? Whether that be through like immediate isolation of your networks or segmentation, but understanding in the event that something did get through, assume that you would not be able to pay because perhaps a lot of the infrastructure that would support paying and decrypting in an easy way doesn't exist for a lot of the ransomware strains that are actually impacting the SMB market. And so, right, super strong backups, host isolation, right? Can your MDR provider take action on your behalf to isolate and contain a threat? But really assume that one of these unsupported ransomware variants will make it into your world. And how would you react to that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. People don't always look at a lot of people still have that mindset of like, I'm getting attacked by like someone in their mom's basement, right? Like they don't understand that this is big business and that like ransomware, I think there was like $1.1 billion in ransoms paid last year. It was like the highest, that like almost double the prior year. And and they don't understand there's just like with our space, right? Like when you're going to bid for a new customer, you're going against, low end MSPs, high end MSPs, and everybody in between. It's the same thing in the cyber criminal world where, like you're saying, like there's going to be criminals that are using these older versions because they can't afford to pay for the Lockbit ransomware as a service. And people, some people don't even understand or realize that a lot of these ransomware families are sold as a service, similar to how you subscribe to GCP or you're subscribing to Microsoft, right? Like it's the same thing in the threat actor world where they're signing up for a service that's processing their payments and keeping the ransomware up to date, right? Like we
Yeah,
worry
no,
about
absolutely.
patching, they're worried about circumventing EDR. So like these tools are constantly being updated to help prevent detection, and you're paying for a platform that's doing that a lot of times in that underworld.
Yeah, I mean, and just like the MSP market, and you and I have to decide every day on where do I spend my money, right? These cyber criminals are not spending their money buying into the Lockbit affiliate program. They're spending their money on initial access brokers. And so they get the better ROI buying the access to your organization than buying access to a more robust ransomware tool. Because at the end of the day, to them, they have ransomed you and you have a Bitcoin wallet address that they are hoping that you deposit into. And so to them, they don't really care the outcome of this attack on you. They care that they get paid. And so they're going to spend their money buying access quickly that's accurate lists. And that's a better investment for them. Just like for us, it's often a better investment for like an MDR service than perhaps trying to roll your own. Lots of give and takes that you have to do there. But we talked about cloud identities earlier. We Huntress has a M365 protection. We offer an MDR service over M365. Some of the things we've seen, it was still in an infancy stage at the time of this report, but a lot of what we're finding still is holding true in our own data. We're seeing, right, account takeover for purposes of compromising communication channels really is the name of the game. We want to see threat actors want to sit, observe your mail, replay your communication style in order to reroute ACH payments, direct deposits, target a higher value target for a spear phishing campaign, and they want to act as you. And the way they do that is taking over your account, but then sitting there quietly and observing. And so with that, we see 64% of our identity incidents. We see malicious mailbox rules set up, which allow attackers to send copies of all communication to an external source. But then also we're seeing, 24% of these initial access vectors are coming from right, legitimate consumer VPNs that they're using to mask their activity. And so what used to be a very easy block all access from Russia and South Africa, it's not super effective anymore. It hasn't been for a while, but we're really seeing this as well, where the number of attackers we see log in from like NordVPN or PIA is just wild. And so, they're subscribing. It's relatively cheap in terms of return on investment. It's tricky to discern a legitimate login from Nord from an illegitimate login from Nord, especially if they already have your credentials and you haven't enabled MFA. There's not much that you can do in order to determine is this legitimate, except for watch what happens next. And that's really where the managed service, having humans watch this activity, really comes into play for your defenses.
Yeah.
But really, I mean,
Yeah. I mean, on
talking.
the managed service side too, Chris, I think one thing that people don't always understand when they're buying into a managed detection response vendor is that yours, like you at Huntress are seeing these attacks across your whole customer base, hundreds of customers, thousands of customers, where like if you're protecting your own business and you're trying to write your own rules and you're trying to detect your own thing, you're protecting it based on what you've seen. But having that insight of like, this is what's happening to my peers and having that automatically feed into your detection strategy is just such a nice to have that a lot of people don't understand when they're buying that MDR. A
Yeah,
lot
I
of people
think.
look at like, hey, I'm not going to get alerted in the middle of the night, and that's why I'm happy about this. But having that insight is so valuable.
Yeah, I mean, even further, I think a lot of people don't realize Huntress's EDR is written by us. We're not reselling somebody else's technology. And so when you're talking through They're like, oh, well, we see this threat over here. We need to enhance our agent in order to detect this. We can make updates to our EDR technology within an hour and deploy that out to you. Whereas other MDR providers that are consuming alerts from a third party EDR, they don't have that same level of discretion in order to update. They certainly can't do things like shove a Screen Connect patch right through it. So,
Yeah.
right, understanding not only the value of the MDR and allowing an external source to sort of watch your back, but allowing them to very quickly pivot that intelligence that maybe a different MSP got attacked, and we can pivot that into the technology that protects your MSP in an hour, like highly valuable. And so we really aim to bring that sort of herd level protection through the use of our technology and agents.
Yep. Yeah, that you know what else that the mailbox rule thing you were talking about earlier, I've seen at the enterprise level, like working at big Fortune 100 companies in the past doing incident response, where like threat actors will try to get into those mailboxes knowing you're the on-prem security analyst, and they'll write rules so when your CrowdStrike or whatever tool is triggering email alerts, that they're just deleting them out of your mailbox with rules, so you're not actually seeing that that malicious behavior that they're doing, right? Like the longer they sit there and understand your technology stack and how you're getting these alerts, they start figuring out ways to silence those alerts. So it's nice having someone else, another set of eyes on glass for sure.
Yeah, for certain. So that covers sort of what I wanted to talk to everybody about the Huntress threat report. I'd love to, Brian, turn it over to you, hear about some of the
Yeah,
things that you all have been observing, and
yeah,
we'll
that's
go back and
great.
forth there.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I know so far this year, one of the things we really wanted to get into, and one of the things I've been driving internally, is we want to start educating people, right, on um, on identity security and why it's important, and like what are all these breaches that are happening in the wild that are impacting our partners and even enterprises and how it relates to our partners. So one of the things we've started is Daniel on my on our team here and myself, we're working on these threat reports to help educate people. Hey, this is the threat that's happening. Why is it relevant to you? Right? There's so much open source intelligence out there. We felt like it was important to help consume that and make it relevant to MSPs. So you know, when they see something in the news like the MGM breach or this giant you know, the NAS API data leak, that they don't just read the article, but they understand what to do with it. So um, trying to use our knowledge and our experience to help educate the MSPs on why that risk is important, or that incident breach is relevant to them.
Yeah,
So, yeah. So starting
I
with that
think.
NAS, oh, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Oh no, I was going to say that the MGM one's really interesting too, right? Like I think a lot of people that opened up a lot of eyes on the risks of the social engineering, and right,
Yeah.
MFA is not the bulletproof defense I think a lot of people thought that it was, and MGM really put that front and center.
Yeah, we had a lot of people calling us for identity verification, like for our help desk automation, where we can do the identity verification after that breach, after they saw like, oh boy, if this can happen at the MGM level, like it could happen to my business. Someone, and we hear more and more from partners, people like social engineering, getting the MFA reset, getting passwords reset, trying to gain that access. The bad guys are always going to look for the easiest path, right? And like sometimes
Yep,
the easiest path is calling someone and asking for the password reset instead of trying to hack that password. So
absolutely.
yeah, I mean they are getting more sophisticated in the password and the credential game. You mentioned credential brokers earlier. So we did have that like NAS API leaks brief that we put out there. I thought it was interesting because it really shows how these information stealers and these credential brokers are really have been growing over the last few years, and a lot of people don't understand that business, right? Like, um, these attackers, they don't care about the ransomware side of things. Like, there's a whole group that's just out there landing malware, doing man in the middle attacks, just trying to scrape credentials and get that credentials, and then they're taking them in a marketplace and they're selling them to the people that are going to land the ransomware on your account. So like there's this whole like supply chain on the ransomware side of things and on the malicious actor side of things that people aren't always aware is out there.
Yeah, it's tough too because I mean, like getting caught doing this is much harder than getting caught deploying malware and ransomware. It's from a risk perspective, as a business owner, the access brokers are taking a much lower risk tolerance to cyber criminal activities than the ransomware
Yeah.
operators and the purchasers of the from the credential brokers. It's uh, breaking apart the supply chain and thinking through it the way that MSPs deliver services, and like the whole vendor model is, when you think through it and realize that you're combating other businesses, really changes this from a cloak and daggers game to any other competitive analysis that you're doing, and really demystifies, I think, a lot of the cybersecurity that people are afraid of.
Yeah, yeah, I agree completely. On this API, on this credential stealer specifically on that brief too, the thing that was interesting about it is there's been so many dumps in the past of these credential dumps where it's just like a pool of all these other breaches, whether it was like, it could be a breach from 5, 6 years ago, so they're old, outdated credentials. This one was interesting because over 34% of those credentials that were in that breach were found to be new and not part of prior credential dumps. So it's really important to understand. Well, it's important to do a few things, right? I think one thing is rotating credentials. Like people don't understand the importance of that. And I know NIST, their new recommendation for normal end users isn't to rotate credentials anymore because you've got MFA. But what people overlook is like their service accounts, their admin credentials, like all those things. You're Typically you're not using phishing resistant MFA against because they're shared credentials. So having some sort of automation or processes where you're rotating those passwords is critical. You don't want to be um, in a situation where you're like, hey, this credential has been the same for the last 5 years or 3 years or 2 years or year, because you don't know where this credential stealing malware is sitting on in your environment, just scraping those credentials and handing them off in a marketplace to the next ransomware deployer, right? So
Absolutely.
you can use Have I Been Pwned? That's a really great place to check, but a better thing is to have a defense around it and be able to rotate those credentials so you're not worried about it. You know that those credentials are only usable for a day or whatever you set that rotation period for.
Yeah, I mean, and if you aren't able to do that rotation, setting up very loud critical alerting when those service and break class accounts are logged in from like a human interface is critical, and making sure, like, again, and layering your defense. Yes, like you want to auto rotate these, but making sure that you're alerted rapidly when they're used to make sure is this legitimate, and making sure that it's not just alerting the service accounts email, right? Email your admins, even your
Yeah.
CEO, make sure they all are aware, hey, this thing that should never be used was just used.
Yep. Yeah. And I think that's a really good point too, because like a lot of MSPs that I talk to are still using um the same account for those service account type activities and for the human accounts, right? So I think it's important to make sure that the accounts you're creating are purpose built for what they're intended to be used for. So because you can turn off remote interactive login on a service account that you know is just running local, right? So or you can limit the access, even though some people find it difficult, right? Like everyone just defaults to domain admin, but limiting that scope of the access is important as well, and understanding what level of access you have applied to these different accounts. But it makes it really hard to detect and monitor when you have like one account that you've got a bunch of human techs and everybody different, every tech you have is logging in and you're using it to like automate deployment with your RMM and everything else under the sun, right? Like separate that stuff out. Um, for your tech accounts, having zero standing privileges is the new thing that people are trying to do. We've got a new product out for just in time that we came out with late last year, that where you can set an account for a tech where it's only active for like that hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. Enterprises have been doing this for years, right, with the big CyberArk type tools, but
Yep.
they don't always work well in an MSP environment, which is why we came out with that capability, because it really helps reduce that attack surface for you as a business, and make it harder for the bad guys to get this privileged access and pivot on it.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. So another one there's another threat brief that I thought was interesting that we came out with, which was the SolarWind threat actors being back in the game again. Microsoft released a statement on this where um, I think it really highlights the importance of identities. I know we've talked about it a lot today. Traditionally, a lot of companies, when they're looking at building up their defenses, they're looking at network controls, they're looking at endpoint controls, with everything being cloud centric now, with all the different SaaS tools, and with the bad guys pivoting because people have been focused so much on the controls on the network and endpoint side. I think tools like the monitoring that you talked about earlier, Chris, on the Office 365 thing I saw in the report, I think it was like 26% of your detections in the Office 365 product that you just released were compromised credentials.
Oh yeah.
Like having monitoring there is so critical, and treating identities the same as you would network or endpoint controls. Like they need to be on the same level as everything else when you're thinking about these controls.
Yeah, it's all about controlling initial access, right? And so in the days past, your endpoint largely was the easiest way to gain initial access through convincing you to download some piece of malware that beaconed home and then allowed me in. It's easier to go after credentials. I don't need you to download malware. I just need you to make a mistake and use the same credentials in multiple places. Um, and then I just need your IT team to make a mistake, right? And these mistakes, it's not even uh, sometimes it's even hard to realize that you have done something wrong in today's sort of attack pattern. For those of you unaware, Brian and I used to work together in an organization. We pulled off a social engineering attack against our own users that most people didn't even realize we were successful with, in which we man in the middle of Okta, and we stood up an Okta page that when you gave us your credentials, redirected you back to a valid Zoom session and did exactly the thing that you expected it to do when you clicked it. And we compromised almost every executive. We got everybody. And most people did not realize that they had just been got,
Yep.
which makes this protection even trickier, right? In a world where we rely on humans to tell us when something bad has happened, it's now even harder for humans to detect that something's bad has happened because the ability to man in the middle or spoof some of these sites is just trivial now. I mean, you can get a new one spun up instantaneously, um, just a few clicks, and then you've got like evil jinx, and there's so many just tools and services that make this trivial to pull off as an attacker. That the cards are not stacked against us, but our defense is right ever evolving
Yeah, and
to
it's
address
starting to
this.
come, you see it more and more coming down market too, right? Like I know like 6 years ago, 7 years ago in the enterprise space, I dealt with an incident where it was exactly what you were saying. Bad guys stood up a fake um, Microsoft login page. They knew that we were moving to Office 365 and they sent out a phishing email to our employees saying, "Hey, you want your mailbox to move tonight, you better make sure you log in here to make sure everything moves properly." And everyone went and they clicked on the phishing site. They provided their credentials. They MFA'd in. The bad guys just passed those credentials through to the back end. They used them to log into the mailbox. And like nobody realized that they had been breached because they ended up in their mailbox like they thought they would. Um, and it's just becoming more and more prevalent and easier and easier to do. So there are lots of controls. You can do the monitoring piece, like we talked about with the Huntress Office 365, where you can see those abnormal and malicious logins and sessions being fired up is important. Separating your privileged accounts from your daily driver is critical. Everybody's like, oh, it's one of those controls that most people don't put in that CIS recommends, but it's so important because if you think about it, if you don't have privileged accounts tied to your daily driver and you get one of these man in the middle attacks, they have access to your mailbox. Maybe they have access to some of your other SaaS tools, but they don't have admin access into your systems. So then they have to pivot again to try to get that admin access, which makes their job quite a bit harder. So not having those things tied together is really important. And then if you can, not having standing privileges is important too, using a tool that lets you create that privileged access when you need it. So you're not just like having this asset that someone can attack just sitting there waiting to be attacked when it's not in use, is also another way to defend yourself against these type of attacks.
Yeah, I tell all of our new employees and our IT team constantly here at Huntress, just because you may need access to something in the future is a terrible reason to give it to you today.
Yes.
Uh, I will give you access within an hour of you actually needing to use it, and you can go about and do your job. But just because you might need access to something in the future is not a legitimate reason to have access to it today, specifically to address the threats that you're talking about, right? Like it's very dangerous to have long-standing persistent access. Same thing, I mean, right, your RMM tools, we talked about in my brief, but this is a really interesting intersection where the protection of your identity on your RMM tools and making sure that your techs really have very low level privileges unless they need them, and provisioning those just in time really can help prevent a lot of these threats in your environment.
So one of the questions that just came in here from Bob was what percentage of ransomware requires a payload slash program to be run on the endpoint? Um, I don't know if you want to answer that one, Chris. I can too. It's up to you.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
so like everything running up until the moment ransomware gets deployed, you can run all living off the land, not deploy any custom tooling at all, right? You can breach an RMM, you can gain access, you can set up persistence through a secondary RMM, but largely the actual execution of the ransomware still will require like a payload or something malicious to be run on that endpoint in order to do the actual encryption. I've yet to see BitLocker be used against you maliciously. That's not to say that it couldn't be done.
right. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, out of all the incidents that I've seen and been involved with, like 98% of the attack happens before that ransomware executes. Like those bad guys, they want to have everything lined up perfectly before they hit that button that kicks off that payload across your environment. Um, so like we said earlier, like it's not typically, hey, this ransomware payload landed on one machine and they're just executing that payload. Typically, it's it's actually interesting because similar to the way you guys have different levels of techs, they have different levels of attackers as well. So a lot of times you have a team that's responsible for that initial access and creating that persistence. So you'll have an attacker that gets on one host in your environment and they're getting that secondary RMM stood up. They're dumping credentials and finding all the admin accounts that they can use. They're testing all those things to see what other machines live out there. They're doing a network discovery. They're kind of getting that lay of the land. And then they're taking that and they're creating like a ticket in their ticket queue and saying, hey, I've got something that looks great. Like this is the business. This is how big they are. This is how much money they make. Here's how many machines we have access to with the credentials and the foothold that we've established. And they hand it off to a level two attacker. And that level two attacker is then taking that information, and they're usually the ones that actually do that lateral movement, and they're the ones that are getting everything set up to kick that payload off. So like a lot of times when you're seeing these attacks, there's a bit of a lull between the when you detect those indicators of compromise around like the network discovery and landing another RMM and doing those other things from when it goes into that queue for the level two attack when they're pivoting off and actually executing the ransomware. A lot of times you're seeing lulls between these different phases in the attack because it's actually different individuals that are taking that action.
Yeah, that lull is shortening though. Like the
Yeah.
time from initial compromise to ransomware is getting shorter and shorter.
Yep.
I would say as you move up market though, like mid-market enterprise, you're starting to see more data exfiltration only ransomware plays, where they'll this is a right programless or payloadless attack in the sense that they will exfiltrate data out of your environment and then hold that hostage or ransom. And if you pay, they won't release it. This was super popular with Move It, right? Clop grabbed more data than they even knew what to do with. And so with Move It, there was this huge lag where you had a threat actor grabbed all of this data and it took them, weeks to a month and change in order to even sort out who they had attacked and stand up different disclosure sites for you make over $100 million as your
Yeah.
business. This is where you go. You make under $100 million. This is where you go. And so uh, attacks are evolving, but in the SMB market, right, this is still ransomware is delivered via a payload for 99% of all cases. It is right, it's detectable, at least on that one machine. You want to quickly isolate the whole environment to make sure it's not spreading. But really, we're trying to catch them before you get to that. And if it trips a ransomware canary, right, it means that the attacker has done something novel that hasn't been seen before, and we need to now update our own detection logic in order to add that attack pattern in.
Yep. Yeah, that early detection is key to prevent spread. Um, so I want to pivot a little bit to some more business kind of threats and risks is some of these threat reports that we've created. One of them was around this AnyDesk issue where it was more of a supply chain attack. And for that, I'd like to pivot a little bit, Chris. I know when we worked together in the past, one of the things you worked closely with was the third party risk program, or supply chain security, or what
Sure.
depending on where you are, people call it different things. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about how important it was, and this may seem like something that a vendor wouldn't want to bring up, but I think from a security perspective, it's critical, right? Like understanding the risks of your vendors and how secure the products that you're buying are and the programs that you're buying are, I think is something that a lot of times isn't looked at.
No, I think right there's uh, a lot of vendors give you a SOC 2 report. They expect you to consume that and go, great, they're secure. A SOC 2 report just states that you're measuring your program and you're collecting evidence that certain activities are happening. It doesn't make an attestation as to the efficacy of that security program. It just attests to the fact that you're collecting evidence that the activities that you're doing, regardless of their efficacy, are happening every month.
Yeah. And
And so,
understanding the scope
yeah,
of those reports is critical too, because a lot of vendors I've seen, um, like being on the other side of it, not being a vendor, but being someone that's consuming these reports, like a lot of these vendors, they'll scope what's in that report down so low, and they won't have all the different trust criteria highlighted. So they might have a SOC 2 report, but it's so limited in scope that like it's not really adding value. A lot of times I've seen SaaS vendors, they'll be tricky and they'll only do a validation of their internal security program. So then they're giving you a SOC 2 report, has nothing to do with the whole SaaS environment that you're actually leveraging, right? So
or they
really,
just hand you AWS's SOC 2 report that has nothing
yeah,
to do with them.
yeah, exactly. So reading that scope, like as boring as it is, and understanding the different trust criteria as well that are included is really important because like not all SOC 2s are created equal.
Yeah. I think we also, as where MSPs are demanding better security of their channel vendors and partners, is demanding really robust readouts from their application penetration tests. And so all of us in the vendors should be contracting out third parties to independently attack us and validate what do they find, and provide us those reports. And then we should provide those to you in a very transparent manner. And so it's much more telling to look at a pen test report from a reputable firm and understand what was the scope of this engagement, what did they find, and did the company remediate it in a reasonable time frame?
Yes.
Right. And so if that firm found a critical vulnerability, did that company have it patched in 24 hours? Can they prove that to you? Will they disclose that to you? And how transparent are they with how they address the findings? And right, the other big thing I look for is, do they have a publicly posted vulnerability disclosure program?
Yeah.
And so, is there a place that anybody in the world can Google, Huntress vulnerability disclosure? If a security researcher finds something against me, I want to know about it and I want to pay them and thank them for finding that. And so, if the funders that you're partnering with, you can't find that clearly, right? It's not to say that they're insecure, but it's a salient point to understand the various maturity levels that you'll find in vendors.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, having a dedicated team is important too. Like as you're asking these questions and you're hearing about it, like I know, Huntress obviously has a dedicated security team. We have a dedicated security team. Sometimes these SOC 2 compliance reports are run by third parties that are just kind of like landing in, you're consulting with them for a month. They put together your SOC 2 report and then they leave. And then next year they're in for another month to do it, So understanding if they're actually employing people and and it's not just to say they have that team, but like one thing that's important is like, are they taking security seriously? Is it prioritized in that business? And having discussions with them or asking to talk to their security team is important because I think it helps drive that assurance that it's not just like a fly by night kind of thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're
Yeah.
also, you're looking for as much of the controls that you don't see in a report as the ones that you do. Uh, SOC 2 is not hyper prescriptive in the controls that you must have in your audit. And
Right.
so
Yeah.
understanding, right, is there a control around MFA for admin accounts? Is there a control around vulnerability management with an SLA attached to it? You're looking for the absence of good controls just as much as you are looking for the presence of them.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know we're getting close to time here. I think we've got a few call to actions that Chris and I have to plug. So I'll start with ours. So I think one thing we talked about a lot of identity security stuff today. There's not a lot of vendors in this space that secure identities well. and that help you with that pillar, right? You need the endpoints, you need the network, and you need your identities secure. So if you're curious on what CyberQP's product does, you can scan this QR code. I promise you, it's not malware, and you can get 10% off of our solution actually by booking a demo using that QR code to see what our product does. But I'll turn it over to you, Chris, for your portion of it.
Yeah, if you're an MSP and you're not protecting yourself with an EDR and an MDR service for both M365 endpoints, or if you need a security awareness training program, we offer something called Neighborhood Watch. We will protect you, the MSP, completely for free. You don't even need to resell our products to other people. To us, right, this channel doesn't exist if MSPs become super soft targets. And so we want to make sure that our channel is a hard target. And so with that, like, please, we're not even going to be super aggressive on the salesy side. If you are not protecting your MSP with an EDR and MDR right now, please go sign up for Neighborhood Watch, and my SOC will watch you completely free of charge.
I love I love that you guys do this too. It's just like the threat report where you don't have to be a customer, you don't have to be paying, but like I mean that's something we're trying to emulate too, is just helping support and secure the MSP community because we're all in this together.
Yeah, the launch of Neighborhood Watch is actually what got me to apply to Huntress. They launched, and I was like, "Ah, that is an amazing idea. I want part of this." And so that was my impetus for joining. I think the notion of securing our partners and our channel is really noble.
That's awesome. Cool. Is there any questions from the group? I know we've got a few minutes left here. We kind of burned it right to the end, but we're happy to field any questions. I appreciate Bob for asking that question in the middle of it. That was great. Anything? Thanks for providing that link, Jared, too. Not everyone's comfortable scanning those QR codes, so it's great having it in the chat.
Of course, absolutely. You might have to get a part 2 going because you guys seem like you really enjoy this topic. I feel like our audience did as well.
Oh man, Chris and I love security. We could talk about it all day.
Yeah, Brian, I'll have to have you on a Trade Craft Tuesday.
Yeah, for sure. That'd be great.
Cool.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for attending. We really appreciate your time. I know your time's very valuable, so we appreciate it.
Yep, we will follow up with a recording and then also your very own copy of the Huntress SMB threat report. We'll include the link to sign up for our CyberQP threat briefings as well. Just want to, again, thank everyone for your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thanks
everyone.
for joining us, Chris.
Yeah, thanks for having me.